Welcome to Harlow on Healthcare. I'm David Harlow, and I invite you to join me by my virtual hearth as I sit down with healthcare leaders to discuss building the future of healthcare. Today, my guest is David Goldsmith, Chief Strategy Officer at WEGO Health, a Boston-based digital health company with a mission to drive healthcare innovation in collaboration with thought leaders, subject matter experts, and health influencers across the patient and caregiver community. David's worked at the intersection of digital health, consumer engagement, and population health for more than 10 years, which must be why I keep seeing him at all those conferences. He's been a mentor and an advisor to healthcare entrepreneurs in a variety of settings and has been an advisor to Stanford's Medicine X conference and the South by Southwest Healthcare Accelerator. Welcome, David, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you, David. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you. The feeling is mutual. So, David, could you give us a short little summary on what exactly WEGO Health is doing these days, please?
Sure. So WEGO Health is working with life sciences companies, including pharmaceutical companies, medical device companies, and digital health startups and others to bring the patient voice and expertise into those organizations in order to build more patient-centered solutions. So we're really working with patient thought leaders and influencers to help drive innovation in healthcare. And our goal, of course, is to help those companies leverage the insights and experience that these individuals bring to the table and really ensure that those companies are bringing products and solutions to market that are speaking to the needs of patients very directly.
Well, that's great. I think we often talk about putting the patient at the center, and I am hoping that what you describe really leads companies that you're working with to be able to do this. Really, for as long as I've been involved in healthcare, there has always been a feeling that there's a better approach to bringing patients into the big tent that's sort of just around the corner, or that has just been enabled by some fantastic new law or regulation or program or innovation of one sort or another. And the question for me is always, are we there yet? Is the latest thing something that's really going to help? For me, this started with the Patient Self-Determination Act, circa early 1980s, where healthcare facilities had to commit to explaining choices to patients and honoring patient choices. And that was really in the end-of-life care context. But there's always something like this happening, whether in the government sector, in the private sector. And I guess my question to you is, have you seen progress over time in this arena? And how does what you're doing sort of fit in with this narrative?
Well, I think that we are seeing tremendous progress, David. You and I have been around long enough and working in healthcare long enough to have amassed a lot of horror stories from other patients and caregivers who can speak to their experience in ways that would suggest we are not making enough progress. But working with patients day to day as we are, we're actually seeing, I think, some really substantial gains. And it manifests itself in different ways. I mean, you can see, for example, now with the FDA that they are making a concerted effort and actually programmatically building the patient voice into more of their review process with pharmaceutical companies, for example. They're actually looking for evidence now from drug companies to see to what extent they've incorporated patients into their product life cycle, both at the very early stages in preclinical review on through to commercialization, and appear to be at a point now where they may even look more favorably at those companies that can demonstrate very tangibly that they're bringing patients into the fold in meaningful ways. Similarly, we've had opportunities in recent months to work with a couple of healthcare providers who are bringing patients in to be a part of patient advisory boards and serving as members of a team to co-create new services or solutions that are designed for patients. I can give you, one example of a provider that brought in a patient through our network who's had a history of treating epilepsy and was a part of an advisory board that included several clinicians and essentially became an integral part of a human-centered design process to look at a range of different needs that patients with epilepsy are facing, and ultimately to determine what kind of solution would be most useful to that patient population. And what they did was involve this person as much as they involved any clinician or member of the care team in that process. And they told us at the end of it that they were all convinced that the outcome of that human-centered design process was far stronger than it might have been had they not taken those steps to ensure that an expert patient voice was at the table. That's not to say that we don't continue to hear stories from patients that tell us there's not a ton of work still to be done, but it literally is the case that every day we're talking to more and more companies who clearly are not just paying lip service to this need. They are taking very concrete steps to bring patients in, and they're increasingly doing it across the product life cycle. We have often seen in the 10 plus years that we've been working with companies a focus really primarily on what I would call the front end of a design process, where companies want to hear about a patient journey, right? They want to understand what are the pain points patients feel, what are some of their greatest challenges, what do they most want to see changed about some aspect of their treatment or their therapy, et cetera. But increasingly what we see now are companies saying that's the starting point. Let's bring those patients back to the table to be a part of a collaborative co-creation process, or work with them to help us raise awareness and to educate other patients, and even to provide peer support or lightweight coaching. So kind of across that spectrum now, that degree of patient involvement is growing, and I find it really encouraging.
Well, it does sound encouraging, and I'm hoping that you're seeing that evolution not just in a handful of forward-thinking organizations. To a certain extent, it sounds like some of this is driven by regulatory requirements or expectations. Do you see this as being driven by market forces as well?
I certainly do. And we are working very closely with a lot of the major pharmaceutical companies out there that recognize that the trust factor that patients have with them is quite low, as we know from the data. That's not a mystery to these brand managers and marketers. They recognize that patients now are making decisions about specific medications or other aspects of their healthcare, much more so based on what they are hearing from their trusted peers in the patient community. And they know that if they don't have more trusted connections to that patient community, they are likely to have more friction on the marketing and engagement side of their work. So, one of the things that we are certainly sharing with a lot of the companies that we're working with is behavioral intent data that we've been able to collect over the years. And we know that 8 out of 10 patients are more likely to ask a physician about some aspect of their healthcare if they have learned about this through someone they see as influential in an online community. they're far more likely to share that information with other patients or caregivers as well. So this is not a mystery to those that are working in pharma in particular, and there are more pressures on them now to figure out how to work in concert with patient influencers in order to ensure that the message that they're getting out to those other patients is grounded in the sensibilities of where those patients are in terms of navigating their care and the types of choices that they're making.
I think you would agree there are a variety of roles that patients can have in this sort of conversation and in this space. I'm wondering if you could articulate the different sorts of roles that you see patients having, the roles that patients can play.
Absolutely. I mean, as I mentioned, one of the things that's been heartening is seeing that we're going beyond just that patient insights work, which we know is critical, but there have been some very exciting examples that we've seen in recent months. One I really was thrilled to see was a company that hired a couple of patient leaders in our network with a history of treating rheumatoid arthritis and who were very tech savvy. And they brought those two individuals into an intensive one-day workshop to figure out how to build an Alexa app that would be designed specifically for people treating RA. So, there you see again another example of let's collaborate to co-create something targeting a patient population. We're also seeing, I think, some more exciting examples now around patients being brought in to assist with content development, or in some cases, really taking the lead and creating patient-driven content. We've had an opportunity to work with companies, for example, who are building new online communities targeting patients in a condition-specific way. And, they're in several cases hiring a number of patients who have a history of treating that condition, who are really able to bring that empathetic, authentic voice to the table. They are excellent writers. They know what kind of message is going to resonate with their peers. So it makes a lot of sense for companies to be working in tandem with patients to develop that kind of a very targeted content. We've also seen in the last year a number of examples where companies are working with patient leaders to do recruitment around specific kinds of research projects. There's a growing recognition, David, that if you've got patients that are hyper-connected and hyper-engaged on a number of different social media channels, they can be extremely instrumental in helping find patients who can participate or would be interested in participating in research projects. In some cases, that may be clinical trials, but in other cases, it could be a whole host of other kinds of research initiatives. And so, for example, we had a client come to us that needed to find over 20 patients who had a history of treating Gaucher disease, which is not a particularly common disease. So it can be very difficult to find patients in that kind of a disease state, and even more difficult when you start to look for patients who may be newly diagnosed within the last 2 to 3 years, as well as patients who have been treating it for over 25 years and so forth. It's often the case, I'm sure not surprisingly, that the criteria around those kinds of recruitment initiatives can be very granular, not unlike a clinical trial. And they hired a patient influencer with Gaucher disease and with a substantial, digital footprint to help them go find those individuals who would meet those criteria. And they actually came to us at a time when they were frustrated. The client was frustrated because they were having such a hard time finding those people, and it was taking a lot of time. It was getting to be quite a costly proposition. And once they found that person who had the reach and the influence and those trusted connections, they were able to find and screen the people they needed for that research project within about 15 days. So, that's an awesome example of a patient leader being very instrumental in helping to solve a very tangible problem. And the last thing I would say is it has been an increasingly common way to work with patients is getting them involved in building awareness within these patient communities, awareness of new therapies, of treatment options, and so forth. And that's an area where we've been able to be very effective because our network is really comprised of the patient leaders and influencers, those where we can see very clearly that these are people who have broad reach, lots of connections. When they post something, we can see that it is shared widely. So, we had, for example, a company recently work with us to find a patient who is a leader in the lupus community. And that person was extremely successful in getting people through her Facebook channel to download a lupus symptoms reference kit for this pharmaceutical company. So these are very tangible and meaningful ways for companies to be working with leaders. And I think, again, that reinforces for me that there's much more openness to this than there has ever been.
If you're just tuning in, this is Harlow on Healthcare, coming to you on Healthcare Now Radio. I'm David Harlow, and my guest today is David Goldsmith. David, you mentioned a few moments ago the idea of developing an Alexa skill using information gained in a development session with patients for a pharmaceutical company. And I'm wondering what sort of personal information would a company be looking to gather through that Alexa application? As you know, we have to walk a fine line between collecting useful information and maintaining patient privacy, and it's unclear whether the infrastructure is there yet on the Alexa platform for maintaining real privacy. So I'm just sort of wondering how you approach that.
It's a great question, and clearly you are a lawyer paying attention to these issues. I can't speak to that directly in this case, David, because I, of course, wasn't a part of that process. But I will say that the conversations that we're having with patient leaders in our community and those that we're observing from a distance clearly show that there's a lot more attention being paid to these issues of privacy. And, some of this, not surprisingly, is in the wake of some of the revelations coming out of Facebook. And
sure, the whole Facebook saga. I mean, I imagine that there's at least a different set of thoughts that people are having around privacy, around sharing information in patient communities, or maybe not. I mean, from where you sit, maybe you're aware of a different perspective. I know to some extent, I think, and others think that rather put information out there and get some benefit as a result, even if it means giving up a bit of privacy, even if that means incurring a bit of risk. I'm wondering whether you have more of a front seat to that calculus, to that process, that thought process.
Well, I think that what we're seeing is that the awareness around these issues and the sensitivity around these issues is heightened, and part of that is because of the ambient kinds of issues that are being raised on a daily basis around this, and very legitimate concerns that patients would have or should have about how information that's been obtained about them is being used, whether that's for targeted marketing or for selling their data, et cetera. And so as a result of that kind of growing awareness, that's translating into more conversations among patient leaders and others around how to be smarter about who they engage with, about things like privacy settings, about getting educated about these technologies and what information is being shared and with whom. And just as we have seen the patient community evolve, significantly in terms of the level of sophistication and expertise around their health conditions, that same kind of evolution is happening with respect to some of these kinds of questions, right? How is my data being used? What are the opt-ins that are there for me to? So I've got the transparency that I'm looking for. What kind of tools are there for me to determine what information I do or don't want to share, et cetera? So, and there again, I think we're also seeing that patient leaders, those who are very knowledgeable and working and have been working with new technology and social media now for many, many years, they're increasingly very savvy about how to use these tools. I will say that there's a concern around what we do or don't know about tools or technologies like Alexa or Siri and others, where some information that is being shared is without our knowledge. It may be shared, for example, in the background, as we know with an Alexa app. And that does start to raise more concerns. So this problem and challenge doesn't go away over time. It just continues to evolve. But the sophistication and the knowledge around the conversation continues to increase. And I think people are certainly, at the risk of a generalization, people are more savvy now about determining what trade-off they're prepared to make with respect to sharing information and in exchange for, as you said, the benefit of either using an app or having access to a website or a wearable device or something else. And I certainly, in the case of Facebook, where there was a heightened sense of concern among the patient community for a period of time, there was a lot of discussion that we were seeing with patient leaders saying, look, we can't afford to leave this venue. We have more to gain than we have to lose. So rather than abandon Facebook and jump onto that bandwagon, let's be really smart about our privacy settings. Let's optimize our presence and minimize our risk and go forward and make the most of this.
Right. As is often the case, hindsight is 2020, and sort of the lack of a regulatory structure around platforms like Facebook has allowed Facebook to become effectively the only game in town. So there really isn't an alternative platform. I know some organizations move to sort of white-labeled, self-hosted platforms that are outside the scope of something like Facebook that is driven by ads and so forth. But those are few and far between. And I think, as you said, there's a bargain struck. There's a calculus made that there's certain things, there's certain benefits from using the platform. The reach of the platform certainly is a great benefit to the community, and we need to live with some of the downsides. So as we wrap up, David, I'd like to ask you, if you were to wake up tomorrow and find yourself 5 years in the future, what is one thing in healthcare that you would hope or expect to find has changed dramatically?
Well, David, it may not come as a surprise to you, given our respective work in and around patient data and patient health records, that this is an area that I'm particularly passionate about. And I would hope that in 5 years, whether I step into a CVS instant clinic, or God forbid, I'm in an emergency room, or I'm at my chiropractor, or visiting my integrative care doctor, that all of my relevant health history and labs and records are immediately at their disposal. It seems so silly in a sense to think of something this basic as a fantasy in 5 years, but we're still not there yet, as you know. And I've personally felt the pain associated with having to scramble and go piece together my health records so that I could ensure that my doctor was aware of my history. And this should be far more seamless than it is today. And I would hope that when I walk in, they're like, welcome back, David. We have all of your relevant records here. We see you're up to date on your vaccinations. We see you had an MRI last week. Whatever that is, it's right there. And it ensures that I've got people caring for me who have the information they need to provide the best possible care.
Absolutely. I mean, it seems crazy. It can go halfway around the world and take some cash out of a machine as easily as you can do across town, but you can't get this sort of information. And hopefully now that we have some data standards and the sort of next generation of interoperability requirements in the law, perhaps we will be able to see that hopefully in less than 5 years.
That's a reasonable hope. I'm with you.
Vision. That'd be a welcome vision. Well, thank you. Thank you, David. I appreciate your coming on the show and talking with us.
Thank you, David. It's really a pleasure.
You have been listening to Harlow on Healthcare. Join us at healthcarenowradio.com. Let's continue the conversation on building the future of healthcare together at #HarlowOnHC. I'm David Harlow, keeping the fire going and holding a seat open for you. Until next time.